I'm going to be talking to you guys today about the conservation concerns and a little bit of research that's going on out of Carl Larsen's lab at TRU. Like Ordell mentioned, I'm a master's student currently, and I'm supervised by Carl Larsen at TRU, as well as Dr. Christine Bishop at Environment Canada. So just a bit of an outline of what I'll talk about today. I'm going to introduce myself just because you're going to be looking at my face for the next half hour or so. So I'll let you get to know me a little bit. I'll tell you a bit about the Western rattlesnake. We'll talk about their ecology, their distribution, and some of the challenges that they're currently facing. And then I'm going to give you kind of a quick tour of some of the conservation research projects that are happening in the Larsen lab at TRU. So I grew up in Campbell River on the island. I am not an interior resident for life. I'm used to a bit more of a West Coast ecosystem, but yeah, I did my undergrad at the University of Victoria, where I majored in biology and minored in environmental studies. And during my undergrad, I was involved in a number of different research projects. And then towards the end of my degree, in 2019, I worked as a field and research assistant to Marcus Atkins, who's now an alumni of Carl Larsen's lab. And we were working on his master's research at a site near Vernon. And that sort of landed me in the snake world, and I got really hooked on working with this incredible and elusive and at-risk species. So from there, I ended up starting my own master's at TRU in 2020. And my research focuses on rattlesnake movement and migration primarily. And through my master's research, I work on the traditional lands of the Osoyoos Indian Band on a project that's done collaboratively with them. And I've also acted as the lead biologist for their research program out of the Inconvenient Desert Cultural Center while I've conducted my research. So that's enough about me. I know you all came here to hear more about the rattlesnake. So as I'm sure most of you already know, the Western rattlesnake is a pit viper, which means they have heat-sensing pits in their face, which make them really great predators. And they're the only venomous snake species in BC. Western rattlesnakes are listed as threatened in Canada under the Species at Risk Act, and they're blue listed in BC. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about some of the threats and challenges that are facing rattlesnakes at the moment. Some distinctive features that you can use for identification of the rattlesnakes are the presence of a relatively skinny neck and a pretty broad triangular head. And the reason for this triangular head is they actually have venom sacs in their cheeks where they store their venom that are then injected through their fangs. And then the third ID feature that most people know right away is the presence of a rattle. But the rattle should really only ever be used as a positive identifier. So in other words, if you see a rattle, definitely a rattlesnake. But if you don't see a rattle, you don't want to use that alone as confirmation of the snake not being a rattlesnake. And that's because the rattles are made out of a keratin fiber, so very similar to our fingernails. Just like fingernails, they can break. So you might see a rattlesnake without a rattle for any particular reason that the rattles come off. And then in terms of size, adult rattlesnakes can range from about 60 centimeters to a little over a meter. Now, species that rattlesnakes most often get misidentified as, or vice versa, is the Great Basin gopher snake. So on the left here, you can see that the neck is quite a lot thicker and the head is a lot more flush with the body, so they don't have that broad triangular head. And you can't see in the photo here, but they also lack a rattle on the end of the tail. And another thing between the two species that you can use is the look of the scales. So the gopher snake is much kind of smoother looking, whereas the rattlesnake has these heavily keeled or ridged scales, which give them a much more rough appearance. I know none of you live in an area where you're experiencing or running into rattlesnakes, but it's always good to know how to ID them. So a little bit more about rattlesnake ecology. Western rattlesnakes are passive predators and they specialize in ambush hunting. So they'll generally kind of coil themselves in a position where they're camouflaged and wait for prey to cross their path, so they don't actively hunt. And once a prey item enters their strike zone, they strike, they inject venom into their prey through their long, hollow fangs, and then they wait for the venom to take effect before they consume the prey. So the venom contains a hemotoxin, which targets and destroys red blood cells, and it kind of begins digesting the tissues of their prey from the inside out. and a neurotoxin, which also acts to immobilize the nervous system. And Western rattlesnakes primarily prey on small mammals like mice, voles, chipmunks, and squirrels. They'll occasionally take slightly larger mammals like marmots or rabbits, and sometimes they'll prey on birds as well. In terms of habitat, they're associated with arid grasslands and sagebrush shrub steppe. During their active seasons, they will occasionally venture into more forested areas as well. And they overwinter in communal hibernacula or dens, which are generally on south or southwest facing rocky slopes. And rattlesnakes undertake small scale migrations to and from their summer hunting and mating grounds. So in the spring, they'll leave their dens and move into their summer grounds, and then they'll return to the dens in the fall. And they do return to the same den year after year. And rattlesnakes are ovoviviparous, which means that they bear live young, which is not the norm among reptiles. Most reptiles are egg layers. And generally, females will give birth to between 2 and 8 young every 2 to 3 years. Now, in terms of the range of the Western rattlesnake, you can see their distribution on the map here. So there's kind of 5 subpopulations within BC. This is based on genetic work, but they're largely restricted to the dry, arid southern interior region of BC. So generally a pretty small range in BC, but BC is actually the northern tip of the Western rattlesnakes range. So you can see on this somewhat blurry map of North America that we're really just the northern tip, and the species range extends much further south. Now, living on the extreme northern edge of the range comes with a series of unique challenges that Western rattlesnakes in more southern latitudes don't have to deal with. So snakes in BC are dealing with shorter, relatively cooler summers compared to further south, and longer and much colder winters compared to their southern relatives. As well, snakes in BC den communally, which is generally thought to be because of limited availability of suitable hibernation sites on the landscape. So that prevents snakes from denning individually. In more southern areas where the winters are a lot more mild, snakes can easily just find a good rock or log to kind of hunker down underneath for the winter. So having this requirement to go to these good hibernation sites where they can keep at a reasonable temperature over the winter adds in this migration time. And that's both time consuming as well as energetically demanding. Now, I mentioned relatively cooler summers, but I'm sure, as you all remember, BC experienced a record-breaking heat wave this summer. And I've just circled the region where rattlesnakes are found in BC. So while that shorter, relatively cooler summer statement is generally true compared to a lot of more southern regions, snakes in BC are having to deal with a really wide range of extremes throughout the year. So now, on top of the challenges that are associated with living at that northern extent of their range, rattlesnakes are also facing a multitude of additional challenges that are largely human-caused. So things like development that include rock removal or blasting can destroy an entire population if it impacts even a single hibernaculum or a single den. Rattlesnake habitat has and continues to be lost to make room for human expansion. So building towns, agriculture, roads, etc. A lot of the really nice places that we like to spend our time, like the Okanagan, are also prime rattlesnake habitat, and we just continue to take it away. Transportation routes can fracture habitats and populations, as well as cause direct road mortality, which is a really huge issue for snakes. We're increasingly seeing more and more people visiting and traveling in the backcountry, which is great that people are getting out and enjoying nature, but this just adds another source of disturbance to a lot of wildlife, including rattlesnakes. And despite public education and laws against doing so, direct persecution is an ongoing issue. So people just don't really understand the important role that these creatures play in the ecosystem. And then we have climate shifts, which are bringing more unpredictable weather, like that heat dome this summer. And with that, we're getting more and more natural disasters like wildfires, which is a whole other thing for snakes to contend with. And all of these pressures are also acting on a lot of rattlesnakes' prey species, which can be affecting their densities, making it making their prey species more scarce on the landscape and adding that additional challenge in as well. So a lot for snakes to be dealing with. Our populations are in some areas doing okay, in some areas not doing as well. But there's a lot of movements for public education around looking out for snakes on the road, persecution, that kind of thing. So things are looking up. So I'm now going to do kind of a rapid fire tour of some of the conservation research projects that are happening or have recently been done in Carl Larsen's lab at TRU. Just gonna have a quick sip of water first. So we'll start with Marcus Atkins, who got me into the snake world when I worked as his assistant a few years ago. Marcus finished his master's last year, and he worked on a follow-up study on some research that was done near Vernon in the early 80s. And it's actually still some of the most kind of fundamental and highly cited work that we have on rattlesnakes in BC. So Marcus's study was a population estimate to kind of see how land use change has impacted the population over time. So when this initial study was done in the 80s, a portion of the site had just been designated as a provincial park, while prior the entire site had been managed as an active cattle ranch. Now today, half the site remains a provincial park. It sees pretty high levels of recreational users on the trails, but it is protected. And then the other half of the site remains an active cattle ranch. So not really very many people on the landscape, but you do have cattle actively grazing in that area. And in the 35 years since the original study was done, the park population was estimated to have declined by almost 50%. And the ranch population by around 30% for an overall decline of around 40%. And it does kind of bring up this question of whether parks and protected areas are actually the best way to protect land for different species. So yeah, that is the first study that was going on. And you can actually see here the division of the land at that site. So in blue here, you have the park area. And then in green, you have the active cattle ranch. So they're directly adjacent to each other. And while I was working with Marcus on this project, we actually designed and implemented a behavioral study as well. And this was based on an observation that snakes in the park seem to rattle a lot less than snakes on the ranch. So our hypothesis was that snakes in the park, where they encounter really high levels of human activity with people walking, running, biking, horseback riding, that they're becoming habituated to people and are rattling less or allowing humans to approach closer before they start rattling. So the idea there would be that it's not beneficial to them to expose themselves to humans that often when they're seeing humans so frequently. So we designed a study to test this, where whenever we found a snake, we placed it under a clear open bottom container that we designed, and we called it the rattle dome. So we put the snake under this dome. We'd allow the snake to rest for a few minutes so that it would not be too stressed out from the initial capture. And then we would approach the snake at a standardized pace length and speed, and we would stop when and if the snake started rattling. And so then we could measure the distance between the snake and the observer. So looking at whether or not a snake would rattle when approached by the observer, and also how close the observer could get before the snake started rattling. And we found that snakes in the park were more than 7 times less likely to rattle at all. And if they did rattle, on average, snakes in the park allowed the observer to approach 2.5 meters closer than snakes on the ranch. So what we had observed was actually happening. So snakes on the park site where they were encountering lots of humans were either not rattling or waiting until somebody was much closer to them before they started rattling. So I ended up replicating this study the following year at my study site in Osoyoos, just to kind of make sure that the findings at the first site weren't just specific to that location and there wasn't something else going on there that was causing this behavioral difference. On the Osoyoos site, the division isn't quite as clear as that park ranch split.
Kalamalka Lake.
Yeah, it is Kalamalka Lake. Yeah, so the park is here and there's walking trails kind of all around. A lot of people are familiar with this park. It's a beautiful place. to work as well. But yeah, so on the Osoyoos site, there are certain areas where snakes encounter really high levels of human activity, and then certain areas where they see little to no people. So I conducted the same study there. We made a division between the more developed areas and the less developed areas, and we found super similar results. So this phenomenon was also taking place at this other site. So this kind of shows that rattlesnake behavior is actually being altered by humans. So they're changing a defensive mechanism that's really important. And this could have a multitude of impacts, both on how they end up interacting with humans and how often human rattlesnake interactions occur. And then also on their own predator behaviors, because we don't know if they're also applying this lack of rattling to other predators. Okay, so next we have Dana I. So Dana is actually going to be defending her master's next month. And she did her research on female rattlesnake reproduction in rookeries. So what's a rookery? Well, you might remember that I mentioned rattlesnakes give birth to live young. So rookeries are these gestation and birthing sites that females use for this purpose. So for quite a long time before they give birth, they'll kind of hunker down in this spot and prepare to give birth, and then they'll give birth to their young in this particular site that they've chosen. So Dana was trying to figure out kind of what are these sites? Are there particular features that females are selecting for where they're choosing to give birth? So Dana's research revealed that the sites that females use generally contain much higher amounts of rock compared to random controls in the surrounding area, and that the rookeries are generally within about 50 meters of a snake's den. Generally, there were rookeries that were up to a couple hundred meters away. She looked at all sorts of different habitat features like slope, aspect, vegetation cover, and didn't find any differences there compared to random control areas. So they're really selecting for these rocky areas. And then she also found that snakes are returning to reuse these same sites in subsequent pregnancies. So they show site fidelity to their rookeries. They'll go back to the same spot. Excuse me. So knowing more about the locations and features of rookeries can help us to make sure that these really critical sites are protected and are included in wildlife habitat planning. Now, another really cool part of Dana's research is she noticed that while radio tracking gravid females, so following their movements, that after giving birth, some females kind of took off away from the direction of their den on these pretty long distance movements. And the reason for this wasn't super clear, but one kind of obvious hypothesis was that these snakes were going to access food and water before going back into hibernation. So like I kind of mentioned, female snakes basically sit and gestate at their rookeries almost all summer. Sometimes they won't eat at all during that season, or they'll only eat at the very beginning of the season in April or May and won't eat again. So once they give birth, they're super skinny, really depleted of energy. So it would kind of make sense if they were going to find food afterwards. So Dana conducted a feeding experiment where she supplemented food or mice, or she supplemented food and water to some of the snakes that she was tracking. And then she also had a control group. And this study was actually also replicated at 2 other sites in the Okanagan. And the idea was that if these snakes were making these large postpartum movements for food, then you would expect those females that were fed throughout the season to not make those movements, and those that weren't fed to still make the movements. It's not what she found. Even the snakes that were fed mice throughout the whole season still made these movements away from their dens after giving birth. So we're still left with a bit of a question mark about the advantage to those kind of movements, but still a really cool experiment. And I've got a video here of one of the females getting a mouse during the feeding trials. So they used fishing rods and warmed up the dead mice and then would feed them to the snakes. So I'll show you that. So pretty cool study, still no really clear answer about why they're making these movements, but we know that it doesn't seem to be because of food. Okay, so then we have a number of students, past and present, in the lab who've been working on an ongoing study on the impacts of roads on snakes. So there's a site in the South Okanagan in a place called White Lake. It's relatively rural. There's a road that runs through, and there's quite a lot of snake dens relatively close to the road, and snake mortality is a huge issue. So Stephanie Winton did some initial research on that. And then we have Jade Spruitt, who conducted her MSc, and she's in the process of writing her thesis right now. Michelle Matson did her honors on this project, and Matt McPherson started his PhD on this project last year. So like I said, the first of these students was Stephanie Winton, and she did an in-depth study that involved conducting road surveys. So she would walk a pre-designated stretch of the road over and over and over again on different days and record any roadkill that she found. And then she developed a model to assess the true number of snakes that were dying on the road at her study site, taking into account things like observer detection rates and scavenger rates. So she could plug all these numbers in and figure out what is the true amount of snakes that are dying on the road, and then do population estimates based on mercury capture to figure out what proportion of the snakes were dying on the road every year. Not particularly encouraging results from this study. So she found that roadkill rates were actually about 2.7 times what was being detected through her road surveys. And this equates to around 6.6% of the population being killed each year on the road, which is not sustainable for a population. And eventually this would lead to the population dying out. And all of this is happening on a road that really does not see that much traffic, but it, like I said, it's just kind of unfortunately placed in an area where snakes often do have to cross the road. And there's a lot of areas like this. This is not a unique site. So this study resulted in mitigation measures being installed, which is super great. So at the beginning of 2019, there are 8 of these culverts installed in kind of hotspot mortality areas. Excuse me, I've got a dry throat. And there is directional fencing put in to kind of divert snakes into these culverts. So when a snake encounters one of these fences, they run out for varying amounts of distance. The snake would be diverted into the culvert and would move underneath the road rather than crossing over the top. And these have been monitored for the past 3 years with motion sensor cameras to see what kind of snakes and how frequently they're using. So here's a couple photos that were captured inside the culvert. So all types of wildlife using these structures. So yeah, Jade is still working on analyzing the data from this study to see how well the culverts are working so far and to do a re-analysis of the population to see whether it seems to be rebounding. So hopefully the results will be good with this mitigation measure in place. And then next we have the study site on the Osoyoos Indian Reserve, and there's been research going on there for a number of years, and this is where my research takes place as well. So this site is really interesting because while some of it is relatively undisturbed, there's also been a huge amount of development on this site. So there's a campground, golf course, resort, vineyard, cultural center, and then all the roads associated with these different attractions. And these are all in areas that snakes would have accessed, and they still do access these areas and interact with humans and developed areas quite frequently. So there's been a lot of ongoing research at the site about how development impacts individuals and populations. So looking at things like how their body condition is affected, how their movements are affected, that kind of thing. So just to give you an idea, here's a photo of the area in 1926. So before the area was heavily developed. And the snakes would have been occupying and distributed around most of this habitat. So most of the dens are kind of up in the hillsides, and then they would have moved down into these low-lying areas, mostly in the summer. And here's what it looks like today. So totally different. A lot of agriculture, a lot of town development, many roads. And this little circle here shows the small patch of natural habitat in the lower part of the valley, where most of the snakes in that area are now restricted to. So it's a pretty drastic change, and you can imagine how that would impact the population. Now, my own research at the site has been focused on juvenile rattlesnakes primarily. So there's been this huge gap in the literature and in our knowledge about what younger age classes are doing. So we don't really know that much about their movements or their habitat use. So I was really trying to fill this gap a little bit and figure out, what are juveniles doing on the landscape? Are they doing different things than adults or the same things? Do we need to know, or do we need to protect different types of habitat to be able to protect all age classes? So I'm working on my analysis for that at the moment. And unfortunately, last summer, a huge part of this site burned in the Ink Creek wildfire. So massive areas of the site were completely, completely scorched. So we've got a new grad student in the lab who's going to be starting this summer, and she's going to be trying to get a sense of how an event like this impacts the snake population. And we have a lot of data on this population, so it's kind of a cool opportunity, despite it being obviously a terrible event to happen on the site. But it's a cool opportunity to be able to compare a population before this type of event with afterwards. Now, another kind of cool project we've been working on over the last couple of years at the Osoyoos site is building these artificial structures, which we call refugia. So they're basically a buried 5-gallon bucket with sand in the base, and they have tunnels made of PVC that lead down into them. So here we've placed them along a section of snake fencing. The snake fencing is meant to keep snakes out of the campground to minimize mortality on the roads there, as well as interactions with people. And unfortunately, snakes often come up against the fence and they move back and forth looking for a way to get through. And that leads them to be really exposed both to predators and to heat. So the sun hits pretty hard. There's not great habitat along the fence. So the idea here was to give them a bit of artificial habitat where they could get underground to keep them out of sight of predators and out of the sun. So you can see this pile of wood here is covering the lid of the chamber. And then we've got openings in these piles of rocks that have PVC leading down into the bottom of the chamber. And we attach cameras to the undersides of the lids of these chambers, and we were able to monitor to see what kind of snakes were using them, how often, how long are they staying. And we saw pretty good use in the last few years by rattlesnakes, as well as gopher snakes and racers. In these photos, it's very dark in the chamber, so it's on night vision mode, so they're not the nicest pictures, but we can still identify the snakes. So we've got a rattlesnake and a gopher snake in this photo, and a rattlesnake and 2 gopher snakes in this photo. So we're actually seeing multiple species using these chambers at the same time, which is really cool. And the idea here is that we could also use these kinds of structures really in any type of habitat where snakes are not able to access the type of cover that they need, or where they've been displaced by human activity. Now, we also use something called eye buttons to monitor temperature and humidity within the refugia. So we had those inside the chambers as well as outside to monitor the ambient temperature. So this graph here is showing the daily maximum ambient temperature from June to August, as well as the daily max internal temperature. So the internal temperature is in red and the ambient temperature is in blue. And so you can see that first thing, the internal temperature is a lot more consistent, and generally it's lower than the outside temperature. But the coolest thing about this graph is if we focus on that week when we had the heat dome in late June. So you can see that while the ambient temperature outside got as high as 46 degrees, which is way too hot even for a rattlesnake, the internal temperature never got higher than 31.5 degrees. So there's huge potential for these structures to be built elsewhere, and these are really promising results in terms of them being used by snakes, as well as actually providing them an area where the temperature is a lot more reasonable for them to spend their time when it gets to these unreasonable temperatures like we saw last summer. And that's all I've got for you. So thanks for listening. Obviously, I'll take some questions, but I'll give you my email address there if anyone wants to get in touch. And then I also just wanted to point everyone to this new BC Reptiles and Amphibians website. It was recently launched. It was developed by quite a few members in my lab, as well as the BC government. And it's a really awesome resource to learn about the different reptiles and amphibians we have in BC, as well as a lot of conservation and more information on threats and that kind of thing. So I encourage everyone to check that out. Thanks so much.